we are going through a time when there is tension with the United States of America over the Khalistani factor. Cleo was just apologizing earlier in the program for Trudeau, and I was like, you don't have to do that. You're not a spokeswoman for the government. Because she's a Canadian living in the United States of America. So there's all kinds of fissures that we have, and we're sort of looking at it only through that. But like, this impacts the world, and it impacts America, and it impacts us in India. How are you looking at this election, Dilip?
I'm looking at it from the point of view, Barkha, of what it means for the world first. And there is no doubt that despite all the talk about the American century being over and being China's century, the fact is that for the near future, America is going to play a very important part as far as global warfare is concerned. So let's take the two biggest conflicts at the moment, and that's not to say there aren't many more that ought to be of concern to everybody. But in both those conflicts, it will matter a lot who wins. At the moment, America doesn't have troops on the ground, but the fact is that if these things carry on beyond the point, what does it mean for the fabled American ability to play global peacekeeper or cop? That's one. The second thing is, what does it mean in terms of the markets? You've heard the whoosh sound of money moving out of the Indian markets. And the fact is that if America goes into a phase of expansionism, big capital is going to find it comfortable to be back home where they are, rather than be in all kinds of places, including China, despite the returns. Number three, what does it mean in terms of the rules of engagement as far as immigration is concerned? Because that is also of considerable importance to many parts of the world. And I'm not talking people being smuggled across borders. I'm just talking about the numbers of people who actually work at making America great. So if one looks at it, these elections matter for the globe on account of all these three things. And I think we need to see that. And I think Americans will vote, I hope, as Maya said, based on their issues today. And I think that's the way all elections ought to go. Tomorrow, we may debate about its impact on India, but I think day after, we'll be concerned about what it means for the world, because at the end of the day, India's rise depends a lot on how the world itself is shaped over the coming years.
So let me bring in Christopher Shivis, who's at the Carnegie Endowment. Chris, one of the things that Trump's supporters like to tom-tom is that he's anti-war, and that compared to Democrats, he would want to shut down conflicts. One of his supporters on our program said, he can close Russia, Ukraine in a week. Didn't make similar claims for Israel, Palestine. Do you see what happens next as having a direct impact on the world? Or do you believe that institutionally, no matter how polarized domestic opinion is at home, institutionally, in its relations with the world, not much will change?
That's a great question, Barkha, and we've been thinking about it a lot at the Carnegie Endowment over the course of the last few months. Obviously, we don't know who's going to win this election. It's a real, on the edge of our seats feeling here in Washington, D.C. Yeah. But if it were to be Trump, I think there's a certain amount of unpredictability in terms of what American foreign policy would look like across the three major regions of the world where the United States has been engaged, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. So in Europe, you're absolutely right. Former President Trump has said multiple times that he intends to bring the war in Ukraine to a rapid close. Whether or not he can actually do that, I think remains to be seen. It is a really difficult problem, and he would need to do it in ways that would be at least somewhat acceptable to America's allies. There would be risks involved, but perhaps he would also succeed. And if he did, that would likely be a good thing for Europe, for Ukraine, and for America. In the Middle East, it's a very different story. I mean, he has got a real animosity for Iran, and as many Republicans do. Yeah. And so I think, what you would expect out of a Trump administration when it comes to the Middle East is doubling down on an extremely tough policy against Iran. And obviously, in the volatile situation that we're already in there with Israel's recent strikes against Iran, I think you can expect that could really go in many, many different directions, including into a much broader war in the Middle East. So in that sense, no, I'm not sure that a Trump administration would really be about peace. When it comes to Asia, it's very hard to say. I think, some of the people who would likely be, important in a foreign policy in a Trump administration certainly are very enthusiastic about the relationship with India, which I think is very important to note, just like Kamala Harris's team would be. So that's actually an interesting point of stability. But when it comes to China, what we know about Trump is lots of tariffs, right? We know that he's going to do that. What we don't know about is how hard he would go to back Taiwan. There are different factions within his camp on that. So with East Asia, it's a little bit of a wait and see policy. But yeah, in some areas, perhaps more peace, but it's very, very hard to know for sure.
Just before I get Ambassador Puri to respond to that, that's very interesting because, I think you say one conflict he could have some luck closing if he were to be president. But in the Middle East, or what we call West Asia, you actually see the conflict deepening because of his response to Iran. My question is, the essential unpredictability, does that in itself, have a destabilizing impact on US equations around the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think, certainly in the first year of a second Trump administration, were that to occur, we would see actors all over the world, other states, other leaders really trying to guess about what the United States policy is going to be, especially in the Middle East, Asia, also in Latin America and in Africa. And I think that creates an inherent instability. There's also the possibility that as they come back into office, a new Trump administration, if he does win the election, would misstep. They certainly did many times in the past. For example, effort to bring peace to the Korean Peninsula did not work out the way that they wanted. And that kind of uncertainty, I think, can be a little bit dangerous for the international system.
Ambassador Puri, we started this conversation with your saying the Indians would be a little happier at Trump. We do business with anybody. I think Chris acknowledges that that's one equation which probably would do better, same. But the essential possible instability that Chris refers to, how do you see that?
Barkha, thank you very much. In some senses, I'm the interloper from the previous session, so thank you for having me here. Barkha, I have no doubt that the man is both transactional as well as unpredictable. Remember, he reached out to the North Koreans. Remember, in the early months after the 2016 victory, he and the Chinese president were on a golf cart in Mar-a-Lago. So let's remember, and which is why I said, perhaps the most dangerous thing is if, in some senses, he finds some kind of a way of doing business with the Chinese as far as we are concerned. So having said all this, I think there is absolutely no doubt that, this unpredictability is a very major issue. But I also completely agree that, this business, which the Democrats have over the years now perfected, which is hegemonic America, and the Republicans perhaps are more isolationist, if you can say so, in a globalized world in that sense. In some senses, Trump and the administration currently in power there, they tend to, represent those particular elements. So I don't want to, use this opportunity for us to have a debate on Russia, Ukraine, etc. But, there are a whole lot of sets of issues which come out of that. But the way I look at it is exactly what was said by our colleague here, that as far as India is concerned, in some senses, in relative terms, we are in a sweet spot. And, however important it is for how the Americans vote, obviously, they will vote on what is important for them. They're hardly bothered about what is important for India or even what is important for Canada or for Europe or even Ukraine for that matter. But for us, obviously, the important element is in the world's truly most important country, what happens, because it has implications for us, foreign policy oriented, of course, because we are not a country which is isolated and all by itself. We want to be part of the world. We want to be part of the global table and so on and so forth. Therefore, it is important for us as to, what happens there. We've managed to put ourselves, or we are in a position where we are in a position to do business with both of these two sides, with the United States, essentially. But which way things can go and what could be the results, I did say what I believe in general is the perceptions here in India that policy space availability with Trump might just be a little bit more. It may not work out in the end because you go into the minutiae of doing things. But
Yeah.
this overall business might just be more than with the Democrats, and that's historically been the case.
Yeah. Maya, I know you said that, today is America's Day, and we've again sort of swerved back to what it might mean for the world. But it is an important question because what happens in America does impact the world, right? So the Americans may be looking at this through inflation, economy, reproductive rights, abortion, the place of immigrants. But the world is looking at it, in terms of what does it mean for China, where does it leave hegemony? Where does it leave America's propensity to get involved in countries that aren't their own? What does it do? There's been a rapprochement between India and China just recently, but Ambassador Puri reminds us that Trump is not beyond actually seeking a similar rapprochement with the Chinese himself. So what do you say?
So, I think you're right, Barkha. There's no question about the fact that while we can talk about American domestic politics, everybody's also looking at it because America impacts the world in so many ways. Look, from India's perspective, I agree with Ambassador Puri in a sense that we've reached a stage where India is in a position to deal with both parties, irrespective of who comes to power in the United States tomorrow. I think for the international question, what is to me more pertinent is not whether Trump says that the Democrats are war hawks or not war hawks or whatever, but I think the way that but in particular, I won't even say the Russia-Ukraine, but in particular the Israel-Gaza conflict has played out in this election campaign, and the way there has been this unwillingness, in a sense, to call out what is happening in Palestine as a genocide, to call out what is happening with the bombing of children on a daily basis, the justification, the repeated justification of what happened a year ago. I think these are impacting the US election campaign in ways that I don't remember seeing the Middle East war.
But you see the two campaigns. But the two campaigns aren't fundamentally different on this question. Only Jill Stein has a different position.
They're not fundamentally different, Barkha. They are not fundamentally different. But I think there was a rallying around Kamala Harris because she was seen as left of center, even within the Democrats. But when she became the candidate, and there was a certain amount of expectation from liberal Democrats in America that she would speak to a younger American who's out there agitating on university campuses. They are the ones, if you, in case people have forgotten, they're the ones who came out in large numbers to sort of support her campaign, raise the money at the beginning when she actually entered the race. And she's lost a lot of that support. The reason they're talking about Michigan in the way they are today
is the Arab American vote.
And Arab Americans who are going to sit out. They would rather not vote for anyone than vote for somebody who's ambiguous on Israel and Palestine. Right.
It's a very interesting point, and I want Christopher to respond to it, and then I'll come to you, Dilip, and then to Cleo. Because while what Maya says is a point, politics everywhere in the world, when politicians seek to be successful, they tend to push themselves towards the center. It is an inevitability of competing constituencies. That is the nature of politics, right? Politics is not driven by some pure sense of philosophy or ideology anywhere in the world. Do you think Israel, Gaza, Israel, Palestine are big factors? And do you see either presidency responding fundamentally differently? Because I don't see the difference.
I think it's obviously a question that has been on a lot of people's minds here in the United States, especially in progressive circles. And Maya is absolutely right. The issue does play a very important role. And let me just point out, for those who may not be aware, but Michigan, which we were just talking about, is a really, really important swing state. Kamala Harris's most probable path to victory includes winning Michigan, which she may or may not be able to do over the course of the next couple of days. So actually, the fact that some of these Arab Americans who would likely vote for her may sit out this election as a consequence of dissatisfaction with her not taking a tougher stand against the Netanyahu government is really consequential. As to the question of whether or not there would be big differences in terms of how Trump and Harris would approach the Middle East, yeah, I think there would be differences because I think Trump would be, as I said a couple of minutes ago, much more aggressive with Iran than a Harris administration would. And also, when it comes to the Netanyahu government, it's possible to see a Harris administration actually taking a sharper line over time once they're in office, especially if they're there for more than one term. And at a minimum, Harris would be a very different kind of an interlocutor for Benjamin Netanyahu than either a Trump or even Biden, who has a longstanding affection for Israel, has been.
Is it a big enough factor to swing outcomes or participation?
There are a number of small little factors in this election, all of which could have very, very large effects. Things like whether or not minority men will actually vote for Trump at some of the levels that polling has suggested they would, or whether they'll decide to just stay home. The fact that if by the same token, a number of women will actually come out and vote for Kamala Harris, even though they've been polling as undecided. I mean, there are a number of factors, and this is one on the list. So yeah, it could make a big difference.
Right. Maya, you wanted to come in. I wanted to go to Dilip, but I could see you raising your hand. Maya, were you wanting to say something?
It was
Can we
interesting
unmute?
what
Yeah.
it was interesting what Chris said about the number of little small factors. I mean, I've been following for the last few days in the US press this little what they're calling a whisper campaign, the post-it notes in women's bathrooms around swing states in particular, and how they're running these campaigns which are encouraging women not to be afraid of voting differently from their husbands. So I mean, I do think, from a foreign policy perspective, I would say Israel and Gaza is an important issue, and that would determine whether people come out to vote or not. But again, I come back to my original point. At a domestic level, at a level that impacts, ordinary Americans on a day-to-day basis. She talks about the price of groceries. She talks about being able to buy her own home. She talks about, a women's rights over their own bodies. I mean, these are bread and butter issues for an American politician. And on that kind of stuff, she's hitting the right notes. But does it outweigh, hyper nationalist, populist rhetoric? I don't know.
Yeah. Those are questions, frankly, I think politicians all over the world. We've seen it in India, people trying to find that central line, Dilip, that you can walk without alienating too many people that you need on your side. What would you be, looking out for? I think American hegemony and where it leaves America is a very interesting point. We had Joe Walsh, a Republican who's a Trump critic, on earlier, and he said Trump is not going to accept the result if it doesn't go his way. And so there's a whole different sort of phase of flux. Cleo didn't agree with that, but what do you say?
I think that's an important issue. But before I go to that, I just want to say that since voting has just opened, and since the most important thing to look at is how many young people and how many women get out there to vote. That is going to be a huge, huge factor to watch for before polls close. Also, you've seen that the number of Republicans who've gone out there and voted before the polls has gone up so much more, because across America, it's very well known that, like the Panna Pramukhs, it is the Democrats who really have the ability to pull out and get people to the voting booths and to get them to cast their vote. So I think that in some senses, that dichotomy or the difference between the two parties has changed substantially, and this result will show that. Now, coming back to your much bigger question as to whether all of this has a bigger meaning and what it does to the way America will function, I think that there is no doubt that Trump will behave the way that he has been behaving. Just because his handlers have had a great grip on him for the last 6 weeks, I don't think that grip will last beyond election day. So you must, and we must all watch and be bad politics but great television to see how these responses go as counting proceeds and as he begins to mobilize
Right.
his people.
Right. I've just got a minute left. Cleo and then Chris, if you want to take the closing comments. Cleo?
Yeah, sure. I think that it would be helpful, especially on the populist front, to take a look at things like the Somali leaders in Minnesota who endorsed Trump and see why they did it. If you look into the crosstabs in the polling, you're seeing all sorts of decisions being made for all sorts of reasons that may come out in voting in ways that are unexpected, especially as we saw, as was just mentioned in the early voting. So get out of the media sphere and listen to some of the Americans themselves talk about why they're making the decisions that they're making.